So now I'd like to introduce our great speakers for this morning, or I guess it's almost afternoon. Andrew is the Policy Director and of Finance at the Washington State Hospital Association. He's been in this role since 2008, and he has a key focus on funding of healthcare through public and private payers and its impact on the healthcare access. Prior to joining WSHA, he served in the provider network contracting and reimbursement roles in major and local health systems and plans. Judy Veazie is joining us with over 40 years of experience in healthcare and has consulted extensively in the revenue cycle and HIM area. And in addition, managing her full-time role in revenue cycle management, she is the editor for, bear with me on this one, Wolters Kluge Aspen Press for over 15 years, editing the Biller for 5 years, and a monthly column in the Healthcare Collector for 10 years. Judy has given numerous presentations in healthcare, especially to us here in Washington, and we appreciate the fact that she has been the president and board chair of AHAM Evergreen Chapter. So welcome, Judy and Andrew, and I will turn it over to them.
Is this working okay? Very good. Well, again, I'm Andrew Busz. I've been with the Hospital Association about 14 years. Before that, the bulk of my career was in managed care contracting for health plans. I was the contracting manager for community health plan, and then actually had time with both of the Blues, and a little bit of time before that in various contracting and reimbursement roles. And so over that time, I've been able to develop kind of a big picture focus on this, that as a healthcare system, you've got the commercial side, you also have Medicare, you have Medicaid, and from the hospital perspective, it all has to work together in terms of some sort of viable mechanism that provides financial stability and access to everyone in the communities in which hospitals and physician groups and other providers serve. And that thing has been stretched very much. I think people tend to come into the legislative session, things like that, with their own issues. There's been a lot of focus on commercial insurance, cost of premiums, impact on consumers. Not a whole lot of attention on what this means for the stability of the entire system and the ability for healthcare providers and facilities to care for everyone in their community. And so, as part of our role is trying to make that known and being involved in the legislative process to either have a voice in terms of things that we think are wrong-headed ideas, but also work on ways that we think are going to further the goals of providing access and a viable system for everyone that's in that. And so I want to make sure I got this right. What is the mechanism to advance slides? Oh, there it is. Okay. Is it just a lag there? Okay, that's me. I finally updated my headshot. It got tired of people commenting how much older I look in real life, so that's me. And I want to talk just a little bit about WSHA, that we're a trade association. A lot of people think that we're an agency of the state, which we're not. We're like the medical association or other organizations that we actually represent the hospitals of the state in terms of the legislative process, the regulatory process. We're often the people that brings a consensus and allows the hospitals to speak as a single voice in those particular issues. We're particularly active during the legislative session. We're one of the smaller departments in government affairs in that portion of things, but we also have robust quality and safety. We have probably about 20 nurses and other clinical staff that work with the hospitals in the state to improve quality and safety in various initiatives. We have a team of data analytics where we provide information that's helpful for our members in terms of both navigating what they need to do operationally, but also informing our policy work on that, where we have good data to sort of back up the contentions that we're making. And then we have a portion, Washington Health Services, that provides unemployment and workers' comp services for certain members that employ that portion in order to do that. But what I'm going to do is really talk about just a few really big legislative issues. Now, we are in the midst of the legislative session. We're kind of at the point where bills, if they're going to progress, cross over from the Senate to the House or the House to the Senate. And so we had some pretty recent cutoffs that is on this point. One thing to say, it's not over until it's over. You know, a bill, while it may appear dead, it could be revived if it's determined necessary to implement the budget, or it could possibly be combined in another bill that may be, you know, progressing through the system. So, you know, I'm going to be fairly cautious in terms of what my comments are, recognizing this is sort of a public forum and don't want to say more than we've been kind of publicly saying, you know, in some of the other broader communications that we've made regarding these things, because I don't want to say something that's going to irritate anyone unnecessarily or anything like that, you know, while we're in the process. I usually speak with a little bit more candor following the legislative session on certain things, but I'm going to be a little bit more constrained in my comments than I might otherwise be. But, you know, I'm going to talk about some key policy bills and budget priorities. And okay, first one is hospital staffing, and this is, you know, really what's been known as a ratios bill for many years. You know, it's been one that's been proposed, you know, for a number of times, but actually this year was a little bit different in that we were able to come to a compromise. Basically solution with unions and legislators. Rather than rigid ratios, and you know, our concern with ratios are twofold. I mean, it's an increase in demand, but without a way of actually increasing the supply of nurses is really not going to have the intended impact. I mean, it would raise costs, but it would also result in basically movement of nurses in a way that would, you know, undermine some of the other kinds of things. We need nurses in skilled nursing. We need nurses in our rural communities. We need, you know, those things. And if it turns into a highest bidder type situation, that would have, you know, pretty catastrophic situations in terms of, you know, the movement that we're trying to do to provide locally based health care in the right setting and those kinds of things. So we were avoiding rigid ratios, but there's going to be a greater focus on reporting compliance with staffing plans. There's going to be, it's not going to be easy, but we do believe that this compromise solution is going to be, you know, better and provide hospitals with the degree of flexibility that they do to maintain access to needed services in their community. But it does have a situation where hospitals that are out of compliance with the staffing plans, and the metrics in the process and all this still needs to be determined, will be subject to, you know, improvement plans and possibly fines, you know, as a result of it through labor and industries. You know, our concern with labor and industries is it has an important role in terms of, you know, ensuring employee safety and all these other kinds of things. But when we're talking about ratios and when we're talking about staffing, you know, we're also talking about access to the community for vital services. And it seems like, you know, that needs to be considered in that. And historically, the Department of Health has probably had more of a say in those kinds of things than L&I, so we'll have to see how this goes. But there is a state-level advisory committee on hospital staffing that will include L&I and DOH staff that is going to basically, you know, determining some of the reporting and some of the particulars of how this process is going to work. And so that is, you know, something that will be coming. You know, for more information, I know we had an Inside Olympia that went out this morning for those of you, and it's something that anyone can subscribe to or look up on our website. And I'll have more information on how to do that a little bit later on, but you can get a little bit more information on, you know, kind of the details of what that is going to look like going forward. This next one is one that I was very much involved with, and as I mentioned, being a former health plan contracting person, found very, very frustrating. You know, we're in an environment where people are, you know, rightfully frustrated about the cost of health care. But the solution of this, or the presumption of this, is that the problem is that, because of hospital consolidation, hospitals have too much contract leverage and insurers do not have enough. And also that the fact that network adequacy requirements actually provides more contracting leverage to hospitals, and therefore what the bill basically was intended to do was basically remove hospital contracting leverage and increase hospital contracting leverage, for the insurers. We're in the situation where insurers are seen as the good guys because they're trying to contain costs, and hospitals and providers are seen as the bad guys because they're wanting to raise costs by getting paid for things. And so it's a really difficult situation, and a lot of work needs to be done on kind of changing that narrative. Of course, this bill was pushed by insurers, but also supported by OIC staff, as well as a lot of consumer and purchaser groups that have, I think, been convinced that this is key to reducing the cost of health care. And we disagree with the presumption and the conclusion and all these things. And so what the bill would have done is basically turn what have been pretty standard contracting constructs for many years and kind of turn them on their head. This is based upon the Sutter Health situation in Northern California, where purportedly there were some abuses of certain provisions or contracting ways, but in a way the bill kind of throws the baby out with the bathwater, and by prohibiting things that have been kind of part and parcel of hospital and insurer contracting negotiations for years. For example, all or nothing has been redefined as any contract in which there's an expectation that more than one facility would be part of that contract. And so while it's directed at systems, it means that if you're an independent hospital and have a physician group, you could not require contractually that the group and the hospital were contracted by the provider, or vice versa, those kinds of things. And so the other prohibition is regarding what's called anti-tiering. And as we know, tiers have been part and parcel of contracts. Any PPO contract, any narrow network is based upon the assumption that a rate will be negotiated based on some degree of steerage, which is based upon some coinsurance rate attached to that product level and things like that. What the bill would have done would prohibit the hospital from having any expectations or requirements that basically the insurer kept them in the network that the negotiation of the rate was based upon. It's basically you can contract and say, oh, this is our preferred network, and then, okay, this is the rate for that, and then it says, well, you're not really preferred anymore. We're going to move you to this rate where we're going to pay 50% of the allowed amount rather than 60%. However, we've got this really preferred network that if you're going to reduce your contract rates to us, we'll put you in it. And once that occurs, that's really going to change the contracting landscape and the assumptions that occur. When insurers cannot be required to basically fulfill the promises they make. So, this is something that we kind of talked about in our opposition to the bill. And then there's the whole idea of continuity, fragmentation of care, if it basically creates an a la carte situation for insurers to basically pick and choose, amongst the components of health systems, on that kind of thing. Potential impact on value-based arrangements, which assume a full team and continuity of care, and then what happens in vulnerable hospitals and communities. There's been a lot of discussion regarding the degree of hospital consolidation and mergers and affiliations. Well, a lot of these have occurred because vulnerable hospitals have been close to being forced out of business because of the dominance of insurers in their area, where they may receive some protection and financial help by affiliating with a not-for-profit system, but the bill would basically allow those same hospitals to be bypassed if the health system was required to basically approach every hospital and every clinic as a separate contract negotiation. And so, we oppose the bill. Fortunately, the bill did not pass out of the Senate, this year. And so, but it is something that's, versions of this have come up the last several years. It'll probably come up again. We're hoping that, in the meantime, we'll be able to change the narrative a little bit on this, in terms of what's going on. But it is, really a symptom of kind of national narratives that are being applied locally in such a way that is, really hard to refute. And then next is affordability through the Healthcare Cost Transparency Board. The Healthcare Cost Transparency Board was basically passed as a real legislation a few years ago, and one of the the concepts of it would be to get a better understanding of what are the drivers of healthcare costs, so we could get a better handle on it. Part of it was understanding that and creating some kind of regional benchmark, and then determining if there were providers or health systems that were doing things that were outside of the norm in such a way that were increasing the healthcare costs. In terms of how it was formed, the construction of the board is primarily purchaser-oriented. And then there are some advisory committees that include hospital and physician group basically work and say the data subgroup and things like that. But what's come out of it, for the most part, has been primarily purchaser oriented. So if you're a provider or a hospital, when you think of cost driver, you're thinking of what are the things that are impacting my cost of providing care? Labor, acuity of patients, utilization, all those other kinds of things. If you're coming from a purchaser perspective, it's all about what am I paying? Is it going up or down? Are my premiums increased? And things like that. And so it's not surprising that given the composition of how the bill and process of it is, the focus is really on hospital cost and creating what we feel is a fairly artificial benchmark that does not really reflect what are the factors that are actually increasing the cost of care. I think if you're a purchaser, you're concerned about what it costs you to buy health care, but you consider the cost of actually providing that health care from the hospital or provider perspective to be essentially irrelevant or not your problem. And that's kind of where we are in a number of different things. And so the bill has passed the House. We are working to try to basically amend the bill in a way that improves the process, that improves the capacity to actually look at data in an appropriate way. We're looking at modifications to what would be the finding process, because the bill as proposed would basically, if a hospital system or provider group is exceeding what's currently a 3.2% benchmark, which includes a lot of stuff, not just rates increases. We're talking utilization, we're talking a bunch of other stuff, that then there'd be a corrective action plan, and then if that failed, then there'd be fines. So basically the bill this year is basically to give the board finding authority over hospitals. And we're very, very concerned about that because we think this is a really wrong-headed approach. It totally basically ignores really what are the things that are really driving costs in healthcare. And so we're working within that to see what we can do to improve the bill, but we think it's likely that it is going to pass this year. And then healthcare transactions, this is also built on a concern and narrative that large health systems are taking over the world, and there's been impact and concern about how it impacts availability of certain services, such as, particularly if it's a faith-based organization that's involved in the acquisition. But what the proposal would have done is really created a pretty onerous process for any new affiliations. And as I mentioned before, a lot of affiliations are really to preserve financially struggling organizations and keep hospitals and clinics open and those services available. But this would have really made it very, very difficult for those kinds of transactions to happen as well. Again, this is another one that we're fortunate did not pass the Senate, even though it did seem to have some momentum to it. And then payment to hospitals for difficult to discharge patients. One of the big issues that have been is patients who no longer need acute care, but are retained at the hospital because they're not able to get moved to skilled nursing or other appropriate post-acute facility. And so you have hospitals basically being kept at the hospitals for long rate. Under the current Medicaid program, the administrative day rate that hospitals receive is currently about $338 a day. So I don't know what a hotel room here is, but it's probably something along the same amount. And so it's been a hidden issue. It's really been a cost that's been absorbed by hospitals, for care that would be more appropriately, done in other things. And we know skilled nursing facilities are struggling. They're having the same nursing staffing issues that hospitals are having, and the state has never really paid very well for those particular services, so it's no surprise. But at an administrative low rate, that's just based on a average patient, means that simple or below average in terms of intensity patients that can get placed, but there's no incentive for the MCOs to actually place a more complex patient that's going to cost more than the $340 in order to place. And so we think the major issue is really capacity, but the way the system is set up creates the wrong incentive as well. And so our bill that we proposed would have done three things. It would have raised the administrative day rate to come something a little bit closer, not all the way, not nearly all the way, but closer to the costs of providing care. And we had, landed on raising the rate to $700 a day. And then the second thing that the bill would do would allow separate payment for surgeries and other services that would normally not be provided in a post-acute or SNF setting, things like that. We have cases where patients are on administrative days and they need outpatient surgeries. But right now those things are not paid for separately because they're not inpatient and they're not outpatient, and so they're in this sort of limbo land. And then thirdly, it would require standardization of how the Medicaid managed care plans actually handle administrative days. There's a lot of variation in how they do that. Some make it really difficult, saying, well, we consider this an extension of the inpatient. We already paid a DRG. We'll look at it again if the patient goes to outlier status, that type of thing going on, or other things that, when does this begin and things. And so the bill, as it passed out of Ways and Means and passed out of the Senate, removed the increase of $700 per day, but we were not really anticipating that was going to be retained anyway. We did get a fiscal note that showed that in order to do so would have cost the state about $32 million to do. And there was this perception of a competition between paying hospitals and then funneling money to post-acute services. What we've said all along is we really don't want hospitals to have to provide this care. We really want these patients to be able to be placed in the appropriate facility, but it puts a dollar amount in terms of what is the cost to hospitals and really the cost to the healthcare system for this issue not being fixed. It also quantified how big this is an issue. The fiscal note indicated the calculation of the Healthcare Authority that more than 43,000 patient days are for patients that no longer need acute care but are being held at hospitals because they cannot be discharged. I mean, this is a financial impact, but it also impacts nursing staffing capacity, bed capacity for hospitals, because for each of these patients, it may mean that the hospital is not able to admit another patient who needs acute care, whose services would help kind of provide financial stability for the hospital. And so part of this bill was to help identify and quantify the magnitude of the problem, and it's done that. And so the bill is going to come up in the House Health Care Committee early next week, and we'll see how that goes. In many ways, the bill has already surpassed our expectations of what we'd do. But if we're even able to maintain the separate payment for the surgical procedures, dialysis, other things that may be, provided sort of normally on an outpatient basis, and then the standardization, I think that will be a big help on that. And then will also help us in terms of our continued efforts to resolve the difficult to discharge issue. And then finally, the Hospital Safety Net Assessment Program. When we talk about assessment, think about a homeowners association assessment, that you pay a certain amount, for a specific purpose. And we've had a program in place for actually, more than 10 years where basically hospitals pay an assessment to augment state funds that actually brings a favorable federal match and is able to be distributed to the hospitals in such a way that actually they come out, at least in aggregate, a bit ahead. And what we're looking at is actually changing that program. The federal regulations regarding those programs have changed. Most states do have programs, like what we're contemplating in past, but they're called directed payment programs, where that money is basically funneled through the MCOs to hospitals based upon a specific utilization formula. And there's some quality measures and things like that that are tied into it. And so we're looking at something that would basically enhance the amount of payment to hospitals for Medicaid services to offset a bit of the losses. Right now, hospitals are losing about $2 billion a year in Washington State on Medicaid hospital services. There's a JLARC study that came out last year that in 2019, quantified that as being 1.4 billion, and it's certainly gone up now with the increase in cost. And so, the bill has not been dropped. While the structure of it has been determined, there's still negotiation going on with the bill sponsors in the legislature. It's not subject to cutoff. It's going to be considered necessary to implement the budget, and so we'll be waiting for that. But that we think that if we're successful in this, that'll go a long way in terms of reducing the unreimbursed cost that's currently occurring on Medicaid services. I mean, right now, I think in aggregate, Medicaid pays about 60% of the actual cost of care, And then we're in a situation where commercial insurers are complaining about the cost shift, which is really, under our national state policy, is really the expected consequence of underfunding Medicare and Medicaid. But, again, that's a political battle that we're fighting at this point of time. And then, along with, I'd mentioned, the nurse staffing bill, which I think we got a good resolution, but we're also, along with that, have a number of bills and budget requests to do what we can to increase the supply of nurses. And I don't have time to go into those, but some of those are still in play, and we hope many of those things, because it's not just a demand issue, it's a supply issue. There just aren't enough to go around, and the sooner that we're able to provide an environment that helps retain nurses, but also produce new nurses, will help us get out of that. And there's a lot of information. If you want more details on a lot of this stuff, I would refer you to the WSHA website. Fiscal Watch is an electronic newsletter that I'm generally involved in providing updates. Inside Olympia goes out weekly and gives, what are the bills that we're working on, what are the updates, what are the hearings that we're going to be involved in. We do WSHA bulletins, which basically, following new legislation, we generally put out what are the implications, what are the things that you need to operationalize these things. For example, the nurse staffing bill, there's going to be a comprehensive bulletin that really talks about all the specific aspects of that once that thing is finalized. We also have a new law implementation guide that basically is a guide to the bill, what bulletins we're doing. In some cases, there may be webinars and things like that we provide, and then regulatory updates and rule tracker that Following the legislative session, there's often rulemaking related to new laws, and we track those, we comment on those, we, basically make sure that our members are aware of things where we need to weigh in on to make sure that they, reflect the legislation, or at least, reflect in such a way that makes it reasonable for hospitals and healthcare to implement them. Then now I'm going to go to the other portion of it, which actually Judy will follow up on regarding updates on financial assistance and transparency. One thing that I've become conscious, I read the newspapers, I get a lot of sort of electronic newsletters and things like that, is there's a lot of stuff going out in terms of narrative that says, that hospitals are ignoring financial assistance laws. It's kind of like, okay, the JLARC study, that I mentioned a little bit said that hospitals, provided $360 million in financial assistance, compared to the nonprofit benefit of, I think it was, 60 something, so it's not happening. There was a large system that has gotten a lot of news regarding, gaps in their process that impacted probably a fairly small proportion of patients eligible for financial assistance, but, given the magnitude and size of the system, included a fair amount of patients. But that system, provided by itself, I think, like $60 million. You don't do that. You don't provide $60 million in financial assistance if you're ignoring the laws on that kind of thing. But that's an example of the kind of thing, talk about. And so, last year there was a bill passed, and this is one where the Attorney General's office that basically raised the financial assistance thresholds on that. We were able to basically negotiate it and make it a better bill than it would have been in the absence of our advocacy. And that's, a few things that were accomplished by that. But it does, basically provide two tiers. If you're basically a small, critical access or independent hospital, you have a different tier than if you're part of a system or a larger independent hospital. And so there's that information there. I'm not going to go into the details because this is not new. I want to make sure that I leave sufficient time for Judy to talk about the operational implications of this. And so this really talks about what the expectations, the discount levels, based upon the various tiers. But there are things that we're able to negotiate in that, in particular, that if a patient is eligible for Medicaid or something like that, there can be a requirement that the patient apply for those particular services. Given how high the thresholds are, that if you, depending on where you go, you can get care for free, up to 400% of the federal poverty level. In light of those provisions, there would be no reason for people to apply for Medicaid as long as they kept going to the hospitals for their care, but one thing that was negotiated in this bill was to enable a process to ensure that other third-party coverage and things like that needs to be explored before those provisions would take place. And then we've provided a fair amount of materials in terms of how to have hospitals kind of ramp up for that. Now I'm going to talk about the federal transparency law, and this is the one that requires hospitals to provide a readable file of standard negotiated rates for services and payers. There is CMS guidance on what that would look like, as well as consumer-friendly shoppable services. And then there was a mechanism for CMS to monitor. I think there's a hotline and things like that for people to report violations. And what their process would be is, they would review the files, they would issue warning letters, they would issue potentially corrective action plans, and then potentially civil monetary penalties. And thus far, just outside of a few hospitals in Georgia, no hospital or system has been subject to the civil monetary penalties. There's several hundred corrective action plans and warning letters that are in place, and we don't know who they are, and even though there have been requests for that information, CMS has not provided that information, but it seems to be a process that's working. Seems like they're fairly deliberate in how they do it. But what there's a lot of parties interested in forcing the name of everyone that's gotten a warning letter to be disclosed, people who have agendas that are enhanced by painting hospitals in a negative light. I think we see a lot of that now. But HHS has released them out of that. And the OIG has a work plan to increase oversight of that. There's this concern that CMS may not be enforcing it enough, therefore OIG needs to step in, which has been a pattern of OIG in recent years. And then the thing that you're probably finding popping up is the narrative that the hospitals are dissing and ignoring the transparency process. And this is coming primarily from a couple of organizations that find value in the free advertising that comes up, and then this is also amplified by organizations that find it favorable to paint hospitals in a negative light, and so they're getting a lot of play. Legislators are seeing it; they're assuming it's true, and everything else. And one of them is patient rights advocate, which basically uses an all or nothing criteria. I mean, both patient rights and Turquoise use basically proprietary software mechanisms where they kind of look at this and then use that software in order to basically determine compliance based upon their own proprietary algorithm. Some of them have contacted hospitals saying, you're not displaying your data according to our proprietary algorithm. Change it to our proprietary algorithm, or we're going to report you, kind of thing. So there's this competition between data aggregators trying to become the standard and having a market advantage over basically the competitors in the market. But in the case of patient rights, you can have a hospital where you could be, compliant on more than 90% of the criteria, but you're branded as non-compliant. The kinds of expectations in the algorithm are not necessarily locally oriented. There's assumptions that every hospital is going to be contracted with certain payers, even if those payers do not operate in the geographic area of the hospital. There's expectations regarding the range of services that would have negotiated rates, even if that hospital does not necessarily provide those particular services. So there's a lot of one-size-fits-all aspects of that. But they're posting their stuff, and the big picture is hospitals are partially compliant or non-compliant. Relatively few are being considered fully compliant. If you look behind the scenes, there's a lot to dispute on that, but they're the ones that are getting the air thing right now. And so, again, these are the issues. What is the full range of negotiated service, full range of negotiated payers, and then alignment of rates between readable file and shoppable services. There's also this idea that some hospitals are saying you have a contract with a payer, and that contract may be just a single rate that applies to all their different products. Well, what the aggregators want is a separate listing for every single product that contract applies to, which a lot of hospitals are not necessarily posting it that way, and so that's an issue that's going on. And then CMS has commented that part of the issue is there is some flexibility that CMS allows in how things are posted, but since the machine readables are really for the data aggregators and other interest groups and things like that there's going to be more work in terms of creating perhaps a more standardized format for some of that information. A recent Kaiser Foundation study actually I think is helpful because they say these challenges do not result necessarily from lack of compliance with the rule, rather highlight the shortcomings in facility price comparison, a lack of standardization and specification reporting requirements. There's flexibility in how hospitals can do this. where the data aggregators are really looking for a proprietary format. And that is the basis of their assertion that hospitals are primarily non-compliant with the rules. And then just real quick updates on the Balance Billing Protection Act. Hopefully I'm not taking up all your time. Okay, I'm doing okay. But the Balance Billing Protection Act, which is the state law, preceded the No Surprises Act. And basically applies to emergency services and then out-of-network services that are provided basically in conjunction with an in-network facility. So really it impacted things like emergency room physicians, anesthesiologists, radiologists, because it's not uncommon for insurers to contract with a hospital and then find a reason not to contract with the providers. And of course, patients get stuck in the middle in those particular situations. And so the BBPA was to address that and created certain expectations. And then along came the No Surprises Act, which, and the BBPA was really limited to state-regulated insurance. So you're talking individual, small group, but also created the ability for self-funded ERISA groups to actually opt in, where they would receive the balance billing protections in return for basically their agreement to pay a commercially reasonable rate and abide by the BBPA's dispute resolution process. And that worked pretty well. And then the No Surprises Act, which basically included the state-regulated stuff, but also included the ERISA, and created a separate payment expectation and a separate arbitration process, where the commercially reasonable standard under the BBPA is based upon, some objective measurement of what sort of the median commercial rate for a particular service in a geographic area. The state uses information from the All-Payer Claims Database in order to substantiate that. Under the No Surprises Act, I'm being crass, but it's basically whatever the insurer wants to pay. I mean, it's based upon their own mean, which means they can have a couple of contracts with providers who do not necessarily provide any services for that particular enrollees of the payer. And then there's a lot of room for manipulation. There's been a process that hasn't really worked very well. And there's been a lot of other kinds of stuff. Well, I'm just going to go. Okay, I need to remember what I wrote down on these things. Well, one thing, because of sort of that discrepancy and the issues with the No Surprises Act, recently the insurance commissioners determined to basically extend the current state's arbitration process through the end of this year. It was originally going to expire the end of June, but given all the issues with the federal process, the state is retaining its process for at least the state-regulated and ERISA opt-ins. And there are some NSA notification requirements that hopefully people are following. There was the expectation of the advanced explanation of benefits and the basically the combination in terms of a joint good faith estimate. Because of basically structural information language issues, there needs to be development of some standards of how that would be done. So those enforcement of those provisions are currently on hold. Judy may have more information on that. And then just talk a little bit more about the NSA independent dispute process. It's kind of gone back and forth. Providers and hospitals have contested this concept that the insurers should be able to unilaterally determine what their median qualifying payment amount is. And the instructions for the arbitration process given by CMS basically instructed essentially that the arbitrators presume that the rate that's being offered by the carrier is the correct one, which makes mediation pretty difficult when there's a presumption that one of the party is right. And so it's been actually it's been contested in court, was basically determined that that the instructions were not consistent with the law itself. And then the CMS was directed to basically revise its instructions. They did revise, but not very much, and the same court basically said, no, it still really favors the insurers in this kind of thing. And so right now, CMS is resuming the arbitration process, but only for services that incurred before October of last year. Right now, services incurred after that under the federal process is still on hold, pending basically provision of updated guidance for the arbitration. So it's a very dysfunctional system at the national level. There's big backlogs in terms of getting things processed. To me, I don't know how many of you were around for that, but it kind of reminds me of kind of the saga of the recovery audit contractor process, where you had this process, you provided inappropriate incentives for certain entities, and then you had a big backlog on appeals, and then finally that got changed. I don't know what's going to be the outcome on that. And so I just want to say, as I mentioned, there's additional resources and different things that I mentioned a little bit before. Also, in terms of the NSA implementation guide, what I've found helpful is PYA. We don't have any relationship direct with them, although I do know some of the people there have on their website some webinar and information, particularly regarding the No Surprises Act. I'm probably the best source of information regarding developments in the BBPA and the interaction of them, but in terms of what's required regarding some of these things, they're a good source of free information on that, and I would commend them to you. So that's my contact information. I will have, I think, a table after lunch if people want to ask me more specific questions on the areas which I might know something. There are probably either going to be questions, more detailed questions that she'll probably be the person for you on that. But I appreciate your time, and I'll turn it over to Judy now.
Thank you, Andrew. Okay. My first exposure to working with the Hospital Association on that process of a law that then has rules was actually in the early 90s when the Charity Access Rule was first put through, and we worked together for a year or more with the legislature and representatives from the hospital side, where basically my experience has been primarily with Providence and working with Peace Health. So all the rules are pretty intimate in what the intention was compared to 20, 30 years later, what the interpretation is. So I found that as all of what you've heard yesterday with Aaron mentioning the lack of trust and the integration of that trust out, it's come through with intensifying the, I guess, adverse view of hospitals. And with this, Andrew's giving you the big picture of all the legislation that's coming through is intended to correct that in the eyes of the public. With this issue, our most recent issue of the from HFMA, there's an article in here about financial care and how important it is, and it does have an important quote that profits over patients, how not-for-profit systems are taking advantage of patients. And basically, that's my message. I'm going to take this down from a higher level, where we're looking at the full scope. And when you look at the full scope, the forces that are pressuring all of this legislation are not on our side, and the hospitals are being presented in a very negative light. I know I've been told that for many years. Well, the hospitals are being presented to the legislature as very predatory, but there's never been a time in my experience that we've had so much, and it's been so intense. One of the things that I'm going to talk about is bringing it down to a much closer operational issue, and that is that we are not just healthcare systems. We are a healthcare provider who is a service, a financial service that is built with our partners, with our vendor partners, with our management of those relationships, and a lot of our patients are being at least in their view, they're being collected on or they're being communicated with, not directly by the hospitals, but by the partner that represents that hospital or that clinic. And those relationships are being presented in addition to the direct issues that are affecting us, for instance, with the No Surprises Act or with the with transparency, is that the picture that's being presented is that patients are perceiving that we partners, the hospital providers, the medical providers, and their vendor partners are using the patient in a predatory manner. As you can see on my slide, they're the victim and we're the predator. And we're being armed up by the relationship that we have with the third party that we have involved. The AG is getting, as an example in Washington State, is getting this picture that providers and the billing partners and the collection partners are preying on patients. The AG allegations is a quote, patients are caught in a profit trap when providers fail to manage their vendor partner relationship with compliant oversight. And I've got a personal story about this. Within the last couple of years, as this intensified, I got a call from the AG's office. And they asked me, they said that they had been given my name in an investigation that they were conducting, and they said, we're looking into an allegation with Peace Health. And I said, well, gee, I haven't worked for Peace Health in 10 years, I'm surprised they gave you my name. Who gave you? Is this a patient complaint or is this? And they said, well, no, it's, so basically as I asked questions, I could tell it was like sort of a fishing expedition, and this is the way I felt. And they were persistent. I even pointed out that it had been over 20 years since I had worked for Peace Health in the patient care and the patient financial services. I'd been doing, much more the regulatory and the billing and so forth for a number of years with Peace Health. So that message didn't seem to stop the questions that they were asking me, but it did prompt me at the time. I was working with Wolters Kluwer's. As you hear, I've always worked with them for many years, and I did their chapter on compliance manual that they put out for healthcare. They have a yearly compliance manual, and I wrote the chapter on revenue cycle. And one of the things that I did talk about is what do you do if you are a person of interest? If you're targeted and you're told, well, we got your name and we want we want to talk to you. And in this case, I had not had contact, and I think a lot of you know that with all your organizations, there's a lot of change, and so you wouldn't really know who to call if you're not working there anymore. But that's how impressive it is when whether you're working for a healthcare provider or whether or not you're no longer working for them, you're in that target range. And the most important thing that I can provide, and I provide in this presentation and then this afternoon, as Andrew pointed out, we'll be talking about answering questions about some of the more specifics about the regulations. But I also have toolkits that I'll be handing out about what do you do to prepare to make sure that you're not targeted as an individual, not just your organization, but you. Are you ready if you are questioned? So my overall goal as a provider will be to provide and improve patient confidence. And consumer confidence is a big piece of what the feds and the state regulatory agencies are looking at. And even though they're looking at whether or not the patient benefits, they feel that if we don't manage relationships and we aren't accountable, that will make each of us as providers and individuals very vulnerable to accusations that we didn't do a proper job of managing our business so that it doesn't impact our patient. And so how do we do that? Well, we have to be able to prove that we are prepared, that in everything that we do, that we performed due diligence and in management oversight. Even though, as you heard this developing story that Andrew pointed out with a lot of these regs. A lot of people will say, well, we don't know. You have, even though a lot of it hasn't been nailed down, it's the point that you're making a good faith effort to be prepared, that you have the documentation, and that you show that you are taking control and managing your relationships. One of the most dangerous thing is if your patient calls in and wants to talk about a dispute that they have, and one of your staff says, well, we don't handle that anymore. That's another company. We don't do that. That's the red flag that you provided the care, but you're not going to help them with the rest of the delivery of the services. So that type of image is one thing that we have that starts with a daily process that you do as a provider. And if you're an individual who's in the line of fire, like anyone in the revenue cycle, that you show that you're keeping an eye on how your staff, the staff in the providers' offices, and of course all of your vendor partners are following the regulations. When I started working on this latest wave of regulation, I was very impressed with the way that the collection agency group in Washington State and the compliance officers that work with the vendors, that work in their offices, were really prepared and very well versed. I felt very confident that if you're a client, that those are your best resources to start working as part. If you haven't had meetings or joint training sessions and developing a checklist, this is the time to start doing that, to see that everyone's getting the same education, and that if you are audited or if you have someone who's shopping for information on you, that you have a very solid path that shows that you have kept an eye on that you continually monitor it. But if you want to know if you're ready, I propose that you have take a very serious look at the requirements on the dispute resolution process. It has to be very concise and it has to be organizationally integrated at every level, your CEO all the way down to your staff. One of the things that was shared with me was that one of the places that a lot of breakdown had occurred was exceptions were given if the person got to the CEO or someone at the top, and those exceptions would change the way that we administered the policies compared to someone who talked to maybe a financial counselor. It has to be consistent. And it also has to stop the process in every section, whether it's in the registration and someone is expressing a concern. And I think we heard Multicare say that that's one of the things that they focused on, is that very clearly training with their staff, that all through at all levels, that there's a stop of the process. Trending the type of disputes that you have is a good way to track where your weak points are. I have also a onboarding process that when you do, if you haven't onboarded your vendors, you need to have one and maybe start a reintroduction of the process, making sure that you've filled all of those holes. Training should be the same on both sides, whether or not it's in your office or there has to be a yearly analysis of whether or not the training has met its mark, in terms, as we know that these new regulations are going to require another level of oversight, and whether or not we're following the timeliness requirements are really rigid, and both at the federal level particularly, there have been some really punitive actions against providers that didn't respond timely to a complaint. I just did a project this year on I had to help an attorney, a law firm in Seattle, with an adverse case where one of the state agencies was filing a claim against a clinic for overbilling and predatory billing on the part of a patient that felt he was being billed a separate amount compared to what someone else, because of his status as a executive at one of the one of the larger employers in Seattle. Actually, I audited all of the billings, of course, and there was consistency in the price and there was consistency in everything. But the letter that came to that practice was so subjective and had a lot of personal comments in it that were taken just at pure value, as if this physician was, and the physicians in that clinic were just practicing in a completely inappropriate way without, and it was as if you don't reply within these number of days. I have an example where we had, there was a bill for $200 for another clinic. It cost them $1,000 just to answer that first request. So, if you're not ready and you're not fine-tuned for that, it will be important that you maintain that on a daily basis. Again, you may not be called, or you may be like me, and many years later you're called to answer, what did you do and what did you know and where were you at the time? Finally, the last two things are reconciliation. I think the other thing that was mentioned about cash payments and unposted payments, there is a weakness there for facilities. I think everywhere I've been in the country, there is a lack of unposted cash. I've always been offered to do that project. I always say, no, thank you. I don't want to do that project. But it is true that there could be a weakness there if you've got monies that have not been posted and are not correctly. That makes you very vulnerable. And that means also you're if you have a vendor partner, that you need to be able to reconcile the business every day, not just your posting, but theirs also, and cancel and returns. If you've got to make sure that is seamless. Then finally, audit. I've always performed audits. I worked years and years ago for Equifax, and we had JCPenney came in and audited us. So I've always audited all of my vendors, and I have that process also that I can share with people. But it's a very good way to show, again, I am watching, I'm making sure that things are done timely, I'm making sure that we're following the rules, and that patient complaints or patient concerns are being handled appropriately at the right level and immediately, and not ignored. The dispute resolution process is going to get to be a centerpiece of most of the legislation, because the patients, as we heard, they feel frustrated. There's a rising sensitivity to, and it's a picture that, as Andrew pointed out, it gives the picture that hospitals and medical practices are the reason for the increase in costs of healthcare, that we are not paying attention and we are operating inappropriately. If the frustration that patients have, I'm going to share a real quick story at the end here. I have a relative who's married to a guy that is actually executive for the PUD. He retired, and he has had prostate cancer for about 10 years. And he came to me last Christmas and said, I'm going to ask you a question just between you and me. My doctor wants me to go in and have a bunch of imaging tests and all this stuff. It's been a year. And isn't it true that he just wants me to have it because he gets more money if he runs more tests? And I said, no, it's the opposite. It's hard for the doctor to not to stay off the radar screen if he runs too many tests. But he just wouldn't, even though in his job, it would be, he's an educated individual, but he really believed that we get paid more the more we do in that respect. So, the lack of trust, the lack of, and each one of the bills that Andrew pointed out has that heart. The heart of it is fear, distrust, and the fact that our image for providers at all levels, we have to make sure that we're all on the same page, and the stakeholders hold very carefully to the rules. I like to use this stop the process. 87% of consumers really do not trust whether or not we're really going to follow through on what our position is. So be prepared, stay calm, and stop the line if you have a complaint. And educate your not just your staff, but yourself and your partners, your business partners, on any of the new rules. Make sure that it's operationalized throughout your organization. So in this afternoon session, there will be time. I have handouts, and I did have one of the journals put a cover story regarding this very subject. on my article, so I have a copy of that if you're interested in it. It includes some of the steps that you should take, because there is, I was really grateful, thank you for the Hospital Association, because when I got the call from the AG's office, I immediately called them and sort of said, gee, what does a person do? And it turned into a great piece of research for me on what do you do if you're a person of interest, and that will be, and I've outlined that in the article, and I have copies. So thank you, and then if you, I don't think we have time, but if we do, if you have questions for Andrew, please feel free to ask him now. Okay. Thank you.